1622. A Portuguese governor sits in his chambers in Luanda. He has summoned a queen to negotiate. Not invited, summoned. He has arranged the meeting the way you arrange a meeting with someone beneath you. One chair in the room. His. The queen will stand, like a subject, like a subordinate, like someone who already understands that this conversation has a predetermined outcome. The queen arrives. She looks at the room. She looks at the single chair. She looks at the governor sitting in it. And without a word, without breaking eye contact, she gestures to one of her attendants. The attendant kneels on the floor. The queen sits on his back as her throne. She will not stand before this man. She will not perform submission she doesn't feel. If there is one chair in this room, she will create another. And she will negotiate as an equal, or she will not negotiate at all. Her name is Njinga Mbande, Queen of Ndongo and Matamba, and the Portuguese governor sitting across from her has no idea what he has just invited into his city. Within years, she will execute his ambassadors, declare total war on the Portuguese Empire, lead armies personally into battle into her 60s, build military alliances that will bring European powers into conflict with each other on African soil, and fight for 40 years without surrendering. 40 years, while Europe calls her a savage, while the Church calls her a heretic, while Portugal calls her an obstacle. History will call her a footnote. She is not a footnote. She is one of the most sophisticated military and political minds of the 17th century, and they made sure you never learned her name. So let me show you who she really was, what she actually built, and why they had to bury her. Let's start with what you were taught. African resistance to colonization is presented in one of two ways. Either it didn't happen, Africans were passive recipients of European arrival, grateful for civilization, unable to mount meaningful opposition. Or when resistance is acknowledged, it's presented as temporary, symbolic, ultimately futile, a few brave but doomed attempts before the inevitable triumph of European power. What you were never taught is this. There were African leaders who fought European colonization for decades. Not symbolically, not hopelessly, strategically, brilliantly, with alliances, with military innovation, with political sophistication that forced European empires to rethink entire colonial projects. Njinga Mbande fought Portugal for 40 years, and Portugal, one of the most powerful colonial empires in the world, never fully defeated her. When she died at approximately 80 years old in 1663, she died as a queen, in her kingdom, unconquered. That is not the story of a passive African waiting for European civilization. That is the story of a military and political genius who looked at the most powerful empire on her continent and said, "Not here, not my people. Not without a war you will never forget." They couldn't put that story in the textbooks, because that story destroys the entire narrative of inevitable European dominance. Njinga is born in 1583, the Kingdom of Ndongo, present-day Angola. Her father is the king, Ngola Kilombo Kia Kasenda. From the beginning, she is different. See contemporary accounts, written by people who were trying to diminish her and still couldn't help documenting her, describe a child of extraordinary intelligence, sharp, curious, politically aware before she should be. Her father recognizes it. In a culture where royal daughters are typically prepared for marriage and alliance, Njinga's father does something unusual. He teaches her politics, military strategy, diplomacy, governance. He brings her into rooms where decisions are made. He lets her watch how power works. And she watches everything. The Portuguese are already in the region by the time Njinga is a child. They arrived in the late 1400s. They came with missionaries, traders, then soldiers. They've been pushing inland, taking land. building the infrastructure for what will become the Atlantic slave trade. They want Ndongo. They want the trade routes. They want the people they can sell. And they've been at war with Ndongo intermittently since before Njinga is born. She grows up understanding something that will define everything she does. This is not a cultural exchange. This is not trade between equals. This is conquest in progress. And the only question is whether Ndongo will resist it or submit to it. By 1617, Njinga's brother Njinga Mbande has taken the throne. He is afraid of her intelligence, her influence, her popularity. He exiles her from court. But he's also afraid of the Portuguese. And in 1622, he does something that will change everything. He sends Njinga to Luanda to negotiate with the Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa, to try to reach an agreement that stops the Portuguese military pressure. He sends her because she is the most capable person available to him. Even exiled, even feared, even diminished, she is the one he needs. And Njinga knows exactly what she is walking into. The Portuguese have been encroaching on Ndongo for years. They want tributary status. They want Ndongo to formally acknowledge Portuguese supremacy and pay for the privilege. They want the right to continue the slave trade through Ndongo territory. They want African kings to act as partners in the enslavement of African people. And they've arranged this meeting the way you arrange a meeting with someone who has already lost. One chair. His, she will stand. Like a subject. Think about what Njinga sees when she walks into that room. She has crossed miles of territory to come here. She has brought attendants, advisors, her full diplomatic presence. She has prepared for this meeting. She has thought through every position, every argument, every possible outcome. She arrives ready to negotiate between equals, and the room tells her immediately what the Portuguese think of her. One chair, standing room for everyone else. A lesser person accepts this, stands where they're supposed to stand, absorbs the message the room is sending, begins the negotiation already positioned as subordinate. Njinga doesn't accept it. She doesn't argue about it. She doesn't demand another chair. She doesn't make it a confrontation. She simply solves the problem. An attendant kneels. She sits, and the governor is suddenly negotiating with a queen sitting on a human throne. A queen who has made it perfectly clear, without saying a word, that she will define her own status, that she came here as an equal, and she will leave as an equal, or she will leave. It is one of the most remarkable acts of diplomatic theater in the 17th century, and she hasn't said a word yet. If you're realizing this story is entirely different from anything you were taught about African leaders and European colonization, subscribe now, because this is just the beginning. The negotiation is recorded in Portuguese accounts, because even the people who were trying to erase her couldn't stop documenting her. She negotiates with precision. She demands the release of Ndongo hostages held by the Portuguese. She demands that Portuguese soldiers stop raiding Ndongo territory. She pushes back on tributary status, arguing that Ndongo is a sovereign kingdom, not a vassal state. And she converts to Christianity, not because she believes it, not because she is surrendering her identity, but because she understands power. She understands that the Portuguese use Christianity as justification for conquest, that they tell themselves and the world they are bringing civilization to heathens. And she understands that if she is Christian, she removes that justification. She takes a Christian name, Ana de Sousa. She performs everything the Portuguese want to see, and she extracts from them exactly what she came for: an agreement, concessions, a temporary halt to Portuguese military pressure. She returns to Ndongo having done something extraordinary. She walked into the most powerful colonial office on her continent, sat on her own throne, negotiated without surrendering anything essential, and walked out with an agreement. Her brother, who sent her because he had no one else, is both relieved and terrified, because everyone can see what Njinga already knows. She is more capable than any man in that court, and everyone can see it. 1624, her brother Njinga Mbande dies. The circumstances are disputed. Some accounts say illness, some accounts suggest Njinga. What is not disputed is this: when he dies, Njinga takes power. She does not wait for permission, does not negotiate succession through the usual channels. She moves. She has watched power her entire life. She knows exactly what it requires. She becomes queen. The Portuguese immediately have a problem. The agreement they reached with Njinga was a strategic concession to buy time. They expected to deal with a king they could pressure, manipulate, eventually control. What they have instead is Njinga, who negotiated with them as an equal once, who will not negotiate as a subordinate now, who has spent her entire life watching Portuguese encroachment and has arrived at a conclusion they don't want her to have arrived at. That negotiation with the Portuguese was never going to end with Ndongo's survival, that the choice was not between good terms and bad terms. The choice was between fighting and being consumed, and Njinga chooses to fight. The break is decisive. She withdraws from the 1622 agreement. She begins building alliances with peoples the Portuguese have been trying to use against each other. She reaches out to the Mbangala, fierce warriors who have been operating as mercenaries, sometimes for the Portuguese, sometimes against them. She doesn't just hire them, she joins them. She undergoes their initiation rituals. She adopts their practices. She makes herself one of them. The Portuguese and the Christian missionaries allied with them are horrified. She converts back, abandons the Christian name they gave her, returns to African spiritual traditions, and the message is unmistakable. Everything she performed in that room in 1622 was strategy. She was never theirs. She was watching, learning, buying time. And now the time is up. By the late 1620s, Njinga is at war with Portugal. Real war, not symbolic resistance, not defensive skirmishes, full military confrontation. And here's what they didn't put in the textbooks about that war. She is winning. Let me show you who Njinga is as a military leader, because this is the part that gets buried most completely. She is not directing the war from a palace. She is in it. Contemporary Portuguese accounts, written by her enemies, people with every reason to diminish her, describe Njinga personally leading troops into battle, in armor, with weapons, at the front. She is in her 40s by the time this war is in full force. She will lead armies personally into her 60s. She adapts constantly. When Portuguese firepower makes direct confrontation costly, she changes tactics. She uses the terrain. She uses speed. She uses the networks she's built across multiple peoples and kingdoms. She recruits. She integrates. She builds coalitions. She accepts escaped slaves into her forces, men and women who have fled Portuguese captivity and have everything to fight for. She gives them status, gives them weapons, gives them a reason to fight that goes beyond this battle or that campaign. She is building something, not just an army, an identity, a resistance that outlasts any individual engagement. And then, in the 1640s, she does something that changes the entire shape of the war. She makes contact with the Dutch. The Dutch and Portuguese are rivals, competing empires, competing trade networks, competing colonial ambitions, and the Dutch have been moving into Portuguese-controlled territory in Africa. They want Portuguese out of the lucrative Angolan trade. They want allies on the ground. Njinga wants European weapons and military support. She wants someone who can challenge Portuguese naval supremacy. The alliance is extraordinary. An African queen and the Dutch East India Company. fighting together against the Portuguese Empire on Angolan soil. In 1641, the Dutch capture Luanda, the Portuguese colonial capital, the same city where Njinga sat on her human throne and negotiated 20 years earlier. The same room, taken. Portuguese power in the region is shaken to its foundation, and Njinga coordinates with Dutch forces. Military campaigns running in parallel. Portuguese forces pressed from multiple directions. Think about what this means. An African queen is conducting multi-front military operations that involve a European naval power, indigenous African coalitions, escaped slave fighters, and Imbangala warriors, simultaneously, against one of the most powerful colonial empires in the world. This is not primitive resistance. This is strategic genius operating at the highest level of 17th century military and political thought. And when you hear the word primitive applied to pre-colonial Africans, remember this. Njinga was running a military and diplomatic operation more sophisticated than most European states could manage. But the Portuguese don't give up. They never give up. New governors arrive, new troops, new strategies. And in 1648, the Portuguese retake Luanda. The Dutch alliance weakens. Dutch priorities shift. And Njinga loses Ndongo, her original kingdom. She retreats to Matamba, a neighboring kingdom that she has absorbed into her power. And this is the moment that defines her completely, because this is the moment when most leaders stop, when the calculation of survival says, enough. Njinga doesn't stop. She fortifies Matamba. She continues to build her forces. She continues to resist Portuguese encroachment with everything available to her. She is in her 60s. She has been fighting for decades. She has lost her original kingdom, and she refuses to accept that this is over. The Portuguese can't understand her. Their reports from this period reveal something fascinating. They keep expecting her to negotiate submission. They keep sending emissaries with terms, with offers, with what they consider reasonable conditions for ending the conflict. And Njinga keeps either rejecting those terms or executing the people who deliver them. The execution of Portuguese ambassadors isn't a single event. It is a recurring reality across decades of conflict. Because for Njinga, the situation is simple. Every Portuguese ambassador who arrives is carrying the same message dressed in different words. Accept Portuguese supremacy, accept tributary status, accept a position within the colonial order. And accepting that means accepting the enslavement of her people. The trade routes the Portuguese want run through her territory. The agreement they're asking for requires her to participate, actively or passively, in the trafficking of human beings. Every ambassador is asking her to choose between her safety and her people's freedom, and she executes them, not in anger, not in barbarism, in clarity. You do not negotiate with the terms of this message. You send the message back, and the message is, we are not negotiating the existence of my people. Sit with that for a moment. In the 17th century, executing ambassadors is an extreme act. It is understood across European diplomatic culture as a declaration of absolute refusal, a statement that no further communication of this kind will be received. A declaration of war that doesn't need words, and Njinga uses it deliberately, repeatedly, because she understands diplomatic language more fluently than the people trying to use it against her. She knows what an ambassador represents. She knows what sending one back dead communicates. She is not a savage who doesn't understand the rules. She understands the rules perfectly, and she refuses them, because the rules were written to make colonization look like negotiation, and she will not play that game. The Portuguese response tells you everything. They send missionaries, thinking that if they can get Njinga to reconvert to Christianity, they can re-establish the framework that makes her manageable, that makes her a Christian queen in a colonial order rather than an African warrior outside it. she reconverts, takes the Christian name again, incorporates Catholic elements into her court, and keeps fighting. She plays every card they give her. She uses their religion, their diplomatic protocols, their political frameworks. She uses all of it as tools, none of it as identity, none of it as surrender. The Portuguese write about her as unpredictable, treacherous, impossible to deal with. What they mean is she refuses to be controlled. What they mean is every time we think we have her in a position, she changes the position. What they mean is she is smarter than we are, and we cannot admit that, because admitting it would require admitting something about Africa they cannot afford to admit, that the people they are trying to enslave are their intellectual and military equals, or in Njinga's case, their superiors. Here's what they stripped from the historical record. Be the scale of what Njinga built. Matamba under her rule becomes something remarkable. She creates a refuge. Escaped slaves from Portuguese operations across the region find their way to Matamba. She accepts them, arms them, integrates them into her military and her society. She is building in the middle of a decades-long war, a kingdom that actively rejects the premise of the world being constructed around it. A world that says some African people can be property. Matamba says otherwise. Contemporary accounts from missionaries who visit, trying to use access to manipulate her, describe a court that is sophisticated, organized, militarily formidable, and economically functioning. This is not a people cowering in resistance. This is a people thriving despite being at war with an empire, because of what their queen built, because of what she refused to give up. And the missionaries who came to find primitive heathens they could convert and control, find instead a queen who speaks multiple languages, understands European political structures, has been conducting multi-front military and diplomatic operations for decades, and has no intention of being anyone's subject. They write home confused. Their letters reveal the dissonance. They expected Africa, they found Njinga, and they couldn't reconcile what they saw with what they'd been told. Let me give you the timeline they don't teach. 1583, Njinga Mbande is born in the kingdom of Ndongo. Her father begins teaching her governance and military strategy. 1584, her brother exiles her from court, afraid of her capability, unable to stop needing her. 1585, she negotiates with the Portuguese governor in Luanda, the human throne, the agreement that extracts concessions. She is baptized as Ana de Sousa. All of it is strategy. 1586, her brother dies. She takes power as queen. 1587, the Portuguese attempt to install a puppet king in Ndongo. Njinga refuses to recognize him. War begins. 1588, she allies with the Mbangala, abandons Christian identity, signals that negotiation within colonial terms is over. 1630s continuous military campaigns. Njinga's forces using terrain, speed, and coalition strength against Portuguese firepower. 1641, Dutch forces capture Luanda. Njinga coordinates military operations with Dutch allies. Portuguese power at its most vulnerable. 1642, Portuguese retake Luanda, Dutch withdraw. Njinga loses Ndongo but retreats to Matamba and keeps fighting. 1650s ongoing resistance. Portuguese cannot defeat her, cannot control her territory, cannot stop the flow of escaped slaves to her kingdom. 1657, a peace agreement is reached, not a surrender, a negotiated settlement where Portugal acknowledges Njinga's sovereignty over Matamba. Let that sink in. Portugal acknowledges her sovereignty after 30 years of war, after trying everything: military force, religious conversion, diplomatic pressure, assassination plots. They acknowledge her sovereignty. 1663. Njinga Mbande dies in Matamba as a queen in her own kingdom, approximately 80 years old, unconquered. Now here's what was happening in the rest of the world during these same decades. In the same years that Njinga was fighting Portugal to a negotiated standstill, the Atlantic slave trade was expanding to its most brutal scale. Millions of people taken, families destroyed, civilizations hollowed out. The same Portuguese empire that Njinga was forcing to acknowledge her sovereignty was simultaneously enslaving millions of other Africans on the other side of the continent. And the justification was the same narrative. Africans are primitive. Africans cannot govern themselves. Africans need European civilization. Njinga spent 40 years proving that narrative false, and they buried her. Here's why. The narrative of inevitable European dominance requires African incapacity. It requires a story where European power arrived in Africa and found nothing. No sophisticated governance, no military capability, no political thought worth acknowledging. Njinga's story breaks that narrative so completely that there's almost no way to accommodate it. She negotiated as an equal in 1622. She built military coalitions sophisticated enough to bring a European naval power into an African conflict. She forced Portugal to acknowledge her sovereignty. She died unconquered. Every single element of her story contradicts what the textbooks need to be true, so they reduce her. They mention her, some of them, because she's too documented to completely erase, but they mention her the way they mentioned Yasuke, a curiosity, an anomaly, a colorful character in a story that's really about European powers. They call her treacherous, bloodthirsty, a savage queen who executed ambassadors. They focus on the human throne moment as spectacle rather than as the strategic genius it was. They describe her religious conversions as instability rather than tactical sophistication. They frame the 40-year war as a regional conflict rather than what it was, an African queen refusing to let her people be enslaved and winning. That's the story they can't tell, because if Njinga won, if an African queen forced Portugal to negotiate sovereignty, then colonization wasn't inevitable. It wasn't the natural order of things. It wasn't civilization meeting primitiveness. It was empire meeting resistance, and sometimes against people like Njinga, empire blinked. They can't let you know that. Because if you know that, you start asking questions. How many other Njingas were there? How many African leaders fought with this sophistication? How many victories were buried? How much of what we call inevitable was actually just better funded? Better armed violence against people who fought back harder than the history books admit? Those questions threaten everything. Here's what the erasure costs us. Not just historical accuracy. It costs us the understanding of African political and military sophistication at the highest levels. It costs us the full story of how colonization actually happened, not as a gentle arrival of civilization into a vacuum, but as a brutal, contested, multi-generational conflict that Africans resisted with extraordinary capability. It costs African students the knowledge that their ancestors were not passive, that they did not simply accept what was done to them, that there were leaders, women among them, who looked at the most powerful empires in the world and said no, and meant it, for 40 years. Every African child who grows up learning only about slavery, who sees their ancestors only as victims, is being robbed of Njinga, of what it means that a woman from Ndongo sat on a human throne before a colonial governor and refused to perform submission, of what it means that she fought for 40 years and died unconquered, of what it means that even now in Angola, Njinga Mbande is recognized as a founding figure of national identity. There is a statue of her in Luanda, in the same city where she sat on her human throne in 1622. In the same city, the Portuguese thought they could make her stand. She sits, still, on her own terms. There is one thing I want you to hold as we close this. The 40 years, because I don't want that number to become abstract. 40 years is a lifetime. 40 years of campaigns, of alliances made and broken and remade, of winters in the field and summers in negotiations and years in between, where the war is neither winning nor losing but simply continuing, because stopping means accepting what you cannot accept. 40 years of watching people die for the thing you're fighting for. 40 years of being called treacherous, savage, unstable, a problem to be solved. 40 years of carrying the weight of an entire people's freedom in your decisions. Every morning she woke up, she made a choice. Not dramatically, not with speeches, just the daily choice to keep going, to keep building, keep fighting, keep refusing, because she understood something that her enemies couldn't admit, that the freedom of a people is not negotiable, that there is no good enough deal that ends with your people in chains, that if the choice is between your comfort and their freedom, there is no choice. 40 years, and she made the same choice every day. In 1622, Njinga Mbande walked into a room with one chair. She sat anyway, not on the floor, not standing like a subject, on her own throne, built on the spot from what was available. From her refusal to accept the position the room was designed to put her in. That moment, that specific human choice, defines everything that follows. Every alliance she builds, every ambassador she executes, every campaign she leads into her 60s, every Portuguese offer of terms she rejects. All of it is the same choice she made in that room. I will define my own position. I will not stand where you've decided I should stand. I will not perform submission I don't feel. I will create my own seat, or I will burn down the room. They called her treacherous, they called her savage, they called her a footnote. She was none of those things. She was a queen who understood that the freedom of her people was worth 40 years of war. And she was right. She died in her kingdom as a queen, acknowledged by the same empire that spent 40 years trying to destroy her, unconquered. They couldn't let you know that, because if you know that African people were never passive, never primitive, never waiting for European civilization. They were fighting, and some of them, the ones history worked hardest to bury, were winning. This is the history they don't teach, but it's the history that needs to be told. If this changed how you see African resistance and what they deliberately left out of your education, subscribe to this channel, because every week we're uncovering the warriors, the queens, and the 40-year wars they tried to reduce to footnotes. Drop a comment. What struck you most about Njinga's story? This is Ancient Africa Untold, and we're making sure the unconquered names are spoken again.